Our story tonight is called The Manger. It happened many years ago, 2,000 years ago, in Bethlehem. There was, in Bethlehem at that time, a man who was considered the best carpenter in Bethlehem. His name was Reuben, and his wife's name was Sarah. And they lived together in a very small house on the edge of town. And Reuben had a little shop out back where he made wonderful things out of wood. Being the best carpenter, you would think that he would be very, very busy, and he usually was. But when our story starts, he was actually bored. He had nothing to do. No one came to him. No one brought tables or chairs to be repaired or made new. Nothing. And so he had time to sit around. He sat around and thought. First of all, he thought about, what should we have for supper tonight? The money is all gone. And then he thought about, well, maybe I could be doing this. But he didn't really have any money to go out and do anything except sit there and hope that work would come to him. Sarah, too, sat and worried. Where will I get food to make dinner for us tonight? And then Reuben began to think about when he was young. Old folks often do that. And he thought about his youth and how he ran and played. And he thought especially about another young man who was his best friend in those days and also became a carpenter. And his name was Joseph. And Reuben had hoped that he and Joseph would work together, go into business together and open a workshop. But Joseph had other ideas. No, he said, I want to travel a bit and see the world. So he left Bethlehem, and Reuben hadn't seen Joseph again. Well, as he was thinking those thoughts, all of a sudden he looked up and there was a stranger standing in his workshop, a very tall, important-looking stranger, and he was looking around the workshop. He looked at the bench and saw how clean it was. He looked at the tools. He saw how sharp they were. He looked at the wood. He saw that that was neatly stacked. He nodded a bit to himself. Reuben got up and came over to see the stranger because he thought, this might be the work that I need to put dinner on the table. He just got up to the stranger when the stranger looked at him and said, I'd like you to make me a manger. Reuben thought that was a little strange. A manger is a box, different kinds of boxes perhaps, with legs to raise it off the floor, and you put hay in it so cows or donkeys or horses can eat the hay as they stand in the stable. Many people had mangers in those days, but not people who look like this man. He looked like the kind of man who'd want a chair or a beautiful chest of drawers or something like that. But no, I want you to make me a manger, the man said. Reuben was just wondering what kind of manger the man wanted. When it was as if the man met his thoughts and he said, it has to be like this. And he explained in detail exactly how big and how high and how it should be made and how the pieces should be put together. And he said to Reuben, it has to be perfect. It has to be finished perfectly. Everything has to be smooth, not a splinter in the whole piece. It has to be as nice as if you were making a bed for a king. What kind of customer could this be, thought Reuben. But as he was thinking that, the stranger went over to the wood, which was stacked at the back of his shop, and he put his hand on the best piece of wood that Reuben had, and he said, I want you to make it out of this. Reuben nodded, and the stranger came back to the table, and he put a coin down on the bench, and he said, this is to pay for it, and if it's not enough, I will give you the rest when I return for the manger. Reuben looked down at the coin, and his heart leapt because it was enough. It was enough for 3 mangers, perhaps, with some left over. And he looked up to say thank you, but the stranger was gone. He just wasn't there anymore, but the coin was there. So Reuben took the coin, and he ran into Sarah, and he said, Sarah, we have money. Take it and go and buy our dinner. And I have to get to work. on the project on making a manger. Sarah smiled and took the coin and ran out to the market, of course, and Reuben went back to his shop and began to work. Well, he was a good carpenter, but he had never been this good. Everything he cut was just perfect. Every piece of wood fit exactly into the next piece. Any time he smoothed something, it seemed to become as smooth as glass. Everything went as it hadn't gone in a long, long while, even though he was a very good carpenter. That night they had dinner together. The next day he finished the manger, which wasn't a terribly complicated project. And he set it down there and he waited for the stranger to come back. And he waited. And he waited and the stranger didn't come. And the next day, the stranger didn't come again. And the next day, the stranger did not come back. However, a lot of other people came because all of a sudden, when that manger was finished, Reuben was busier than he'd ever been. It seemed like half of Bethlehem needed a new chair or something fixed or a new bed because people were coming to stay. So they all came and asked Reuben to do it. He had more work than he had ever had, and he began to work from morning to night, and he sang a little bit and hummed as he worked, and he was probably the happiest person in Bethlehem for a few days because he was just so busy, and he liked to be so busy. One day, a few days later, an old friend Isaac came in to see him. Isaac owned an inn at the edge of town, a small inn, nothing fancy. And Isaac came bustling in, and he said, Reuben, my friend. Reuben put down his saw and looked up. Yes, he said. Reuben, I want you to make... And Isaac looked at the corner of the room where Reuben had put the manger, and he said, me a manger? I came to ask you to make me a manger. Do you know the old stable in back of my inn that's been closed up for so many years? I decided to clean it out, and my boy Benjamin has been cleaning it and doing nothing else. It seems like for days and days, and it's looking really clean and good. And I want a manger for it, and that is the manger I want. Sell it to me. Reuben shook his head. I'm sorry, he said. It's sold. Not for sale? Sold? What do you mean? And so Reuben had to tell him the story about the stranger who had already bought and paid for the manger, but didn't come for it. Said Isaac. Well, you just made one. Would you do me a favor? I can see you're busy, but just make me another one, just like that one. I want one just like that. All right, said Reuben. Come back tomorrow. And he set to work. And he took his second best piece of wood, and he began to cut out just in the way he had that one. He already knew it in his head. And he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. The first two cuts he made, one was too long and one was too short. When he tried to fit things together, they didn't fit. Finally, he gave up and threw those pieces down in the scrap pile and took another piece and began to work a second time. And this time, things seemed to split and just come apart. And he was getting frustrated and put that down. He said, one more time, Reuben, get it right. And he took a third piece of wood and he began to cut, but it went no better. And he finally put it all down and he said, Isaac's going to have to wait for his manger. Isaac came back the next day and said, is my manger ready? And Reuben had to tell him why it wasn't and how he couldn't make one now because nothing seemed to go right. They both shook their heads in wonderment at that. Finally, Isaac, sitting there, looked up and said, you know what, Reuben? I'm going to borrow your manger, the other one, the one you won't sell me. I don't want to buy it, but you can give it to me. I'll take it there and put it there. If the stranger does come, you can send a boy down and I'll send it right there. He can have it in a few minutes and you don't have to come down and get it at all yourself. Wow. Reuben looked about himself and thought and said, no, I can't do that. He was imagining the stranger coming back and saying, I'm here for my manger. And he having to say, well, it's down the road at my friend Isaac's. So He said no. However, he had forgotten how stubborn Isaac could be. And Isaac said, now, Reuben, listen, it's in the way. It's going to get bumped here. And he had 100 reasons why Reuben had to give him the manger on loan. They talked for about an hour. Some would say they argued, but they argued in the way friends argue. And finally, Reuben shook his head and said, okay. Isaac, take it, be careful, and I'll get it when I need it. Isaac wrapped it up in his cloak, took it out the door, and as he was leaving, he turned and said, you can come see it any time, and if there's a speck of dirt on it even, then I'll give it right back to you. It's going to be perfect. Reuben nodded and went back to work on the many pieces of work he already had to do. He worked and worked day after day. Things were getting busy in Bethlehem. People were coming through. The taxing was going on in Jerusalem, and everyone had to go there. Inns were filling up. Houses were filling up. People who had 2 or 3 extra beds let other people stay in them. Things were getting busy. Finally, there was one day when everything in Bethlehem was full. Reuben, of course, wasn't affected by this. He and Sarah had one little bed, and that's all they had. He just kept working. That night, they went to bed. Reuben turned out the light in their little room up on the second floor of their house. He slept very well, because that's how you sleep when you've done a good day's work. And he slept all through the night and into the morning hours before dawn, when suddenly he was wakened, and it was still quite dark, and he heard singing in the streets. He thought, somebody's been out drinking all night and heading back, making a lot of noise. I'll just ask them to please be quiet. And he opened his little window and looked out to see who travelers been drinking, and lo and behold, there were no travelers there. There were 3 shepherds there. And these were shepherds he knew. They lived on the end of town. "Hello!" yelled Reuben out his window, and they stopped and looked up. "Shouldn't you be off in your fields," he said, "instead of making all this noise and waking good folks?" "Reuben," said one of the shepherds who recognized him. "Reuben, come down, come down. Listen what's happened. We were in our fields. We were there. An angel of God came to us and shone light all around us and told us that the Messiah was going to be born in Bethlehem. Not only in Bethlehem, but in that old stable that Isaac has down the road. And we went and saw it was a child, a special child, Reuben, and we saw it before the king, before the governor, before the priests even. We saw this child. We, shepherds, poor shepherds." And they began to talk among each other. "I'm coming down," said Reuben. "I'm coming down." This interested him. The stable? Isaac's stable? Where his manger was? He got down there, and they went back together. The shepherds tried to tell him all about it, but they kept interrupting each other. They were so excited. He was getting confused. He didn't quite know if anything really had happened until they came to the stable. He could see light shining out, and when he opened the door and peeked in, he knew that the shepherds had told the truth. There, lying on a bed of straw, was a child, a special child, and light seemed to be coming from the child. Bending over the child, he saw a young woman dressed in blue and red, the child's mother. Behind her was a figure of light. He realized right away this was an angel who he had never seen. He had seen an angel before, because as he looked at the angel and looked at his face, he recognized that that was the stranger's face who had come to him to order the manger. My goodness, he thought, the manger. Yes, and he looked down, because he'd forgotten all about it, and he saw that the child was lying on straw in his manger, the one he had made, and all of a sudden he understood. He understood why the stranger never came back. He understood why Isaac had to get that manger. And he understood why it had to be finished like the bed for a king, as smooth as a bed for a king, the stranger had said. because it was a bed for a king. And without thinking any more, he knelt down and took off his hat and bowed his head before the child. He was only there a short while when he heard his name called. "Reuben, Reuben," said a voice that he knew, for it was the angel. "Reuben, faithful servant of God, look up. Look up. You were chosen by God to be a part of this, thou faithful one." He looked up at the mother, at the angel, and at the father, who was standing over to one side, an older man who wasn't looking at his wife or at his baby. He was looking at Reuben, right in the eyes, and he was smiling. Reuben looked at him and said, "Don't I know that man? Another familiar face, and it seems to me, is that Joseph? Joseph, is that..." Joseph ran to him and they embraced. It was his old friend Joseph, who he hadn't seen in many years. They talked. He ran back to house and got Sarah and brought her there. They all talked. The next day they met again and talked. And a few days later, when the old man and his younger wife and the baby went back to their home in Nazareth, Reuben and Sarah decided that they would sell their little house and close up the shop there and move to Nazareth with Joseph and his wife and open up a shop there and be close to Reuben's old friend and his wife. And so they did. The manger stayed with Isaac. Isaac wanted it. Reuben had no use for it. It had served its lofty purpose. Isaac, in years to come, would keep the manger and the stable nicely locked, and if a special guest came, someone he liked a lot, he would say, come with me," and they would take them out and open the stable and show them the manger and the rest of the stable and tell them about the wonderful things that had happened that day. We don't know what happened to that manger. We don't know what happened to the stable. It's no longer there. But the place where they were is still there. And even to this day, people travel halfway around the world sometimes to go to that place and remember the child that was born there. And that is the story of the manger.